Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Barrett, and I am an implementation partner with the National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. Thank you so much for joining this session. We are recording this session, so just wanted to make sure you all knew that. When we get to the question and answer section, we will pass the microphone so that we all show up, our voices all show up on that feed. So just kind of that pre-correction. We are in a session to talk about embedding crisis response and threat assessment within a multi-tiered system of support. And as we set up this conference, we want to make sure that as we gain new knowledge, we are working together with our teams to make sure that we're taking that new knowledge and able to apply it with a level of fidelity and precision that leads to outcomes for our kids. So we always try to set up the conditions to make that happen. And so we want you, as you're listening to this new content that we have for you today, we want to make sure that you are incorporating this as part of your priority within your existing system, that you're identifying a team that would oversee this work, because this is always a team sport. We want to make sure that if you're saying yes to this, what are you saying no to, so we don't overwhelm the system and are unable to do anything very well. And we always want to make sure that we're assessing for fidelity and impact, because we never want to assign blame to kids for not succeeding when we're not holding ourselves accountable for high-level fidelity of implementation of evidence-based practices. So for today's session, I want to set us up with 3 key learning objectives. We are going to learn from our colleagues and friends, Kona and Kira, today about the current mental health trends in the national context. We heard a little bit from our keynote this morning. We want to dive into a little bit more detail. We want to talk about some of the ways we're creating the conditions for everybody to have a role in how to create recovery and response systems. And we really want to embed crisis response into that prevention framework. Too often, we're seeing this being situated outside of our offices, and we want to pull this again into that system of prevention. So with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Dr. Kira Mailsath and Dr. Tona McGuire to give us all their guidance and expertise and amazing data. So with that,
Sure. Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kira Mailsath. Nice to be here. I'm really happy to share some of this information and content with you. My background is not as an I do work in education. I teach at Seattle U, but I'm a clinical psychologist. And Tona and I specialize in crisis response and disaster recovery. So it's been a very busy several years, and it seems like it's continuing to get busier. So we want to share with you some ideas today around shifting the terminology and the language that we're using. Oops, that's a little bit weird, sorry. Away from threat assessment, which is a yes or no, are they or aren't they, to more of a risk reduction concept. What can we do to support these students? The next one is really about the limits of prediction science. It's where psychology and human sciences research, as you all know, is very complicated. So we have to make sure that we're collecting data in the right way and that we're using the data that we collect in a meaningful application. So we're not just like counting the wrong things and applying it in an incorrect fashion. The third section that we're going to cover is what we can actually do to reduce risk. So Tona's going to walk you through some examples of programs, talk a little bit about things we do have efficacy data for on the approaches that work to support kids who are in crisis, to support families and educators who find themselves sort of surrounding students who are really struggling with things and what's effective there. And then we're going to summarize best practices. I love acronyms, so I came up with another acronym model to kind of give you some high-level takeaway points for the things that we know are effective when it comes to recovery from crisis and disaster. So I'd like to start off with a quote from Russell Aikoff. This is a guy who has been doing organizational group dynamics work for years and years. But it's really important to set the stage for what we're trying to do with risk reduction and threat assessment. A problem never exists in isolation. It is surrounded by other problems in space and time. The more of the context of a problem that a scientist can comprehend, the greater are their chances of finding a truly adequate solution. None of this stuff that we're seeing right now, as Lucille was mentioning in the keynote, is happening in a bubble. It has been coming for a long time. Behavioral health issues have continued to increase, and we're experiencing a pretty significant and dramatic layering effect by what happened during the pandemic. So we can't ignore the geopolitical, social, cultural influences that are being placed on families and on teachers that are reflecting themselves into what we're seeing with kids across the age spectrum, really. Chana is going to talk really briefly about some examples, and then we'll move on to threat and risk assessment.
Thank you. All right. I know that many of you are aware of ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so we want to address kind of the layers, beginning with things that have happened to kids before other kinds of traumatic events. My colleague, Dr. Mossep, likes to call this the trauma lasagna. It's always complicated. So if you think about what you're seeing in the classroom, what you're seeing amongst your colleagues, and what you're seeing amongst yourselves, it may be a combination of things that have happened previously, things that we grew up with, experiences that we've had as kids, other traumatic impacts. Certainly COVID was, when you think about a once in 100-year pandemic, that's a disaster. And then secondary kind of crisis impacts from that, along with other things. So just because we went through COVID doesn't mean we didn't also have wildfires and floods and school shootings and other things that have impacted all of us, that tremendous division and upheaval related to all of the things that were happening in the last few years. So what happened to kids during COVID? And I'm going to go through this very quickly because there isn't a person in this room that doesn't know that things were increasing all the way up through 2018, 2019, and then they went hockey stick. So parents lost their jobs, kids experienced abuse. We know that interpersonal violence goes up in a disaster, was certainly going up in COVID because people were locked in their homes with their abusers. And so there was a lot of stress and a lot of violence that happened there. Emotional abuse, kids and adults began to feel sad and experience poor mental health all the way around. Because of many things, academic performance went down in a significant way. And then there are a number of common experiences and challenges that we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about.
We're just going to keep switching back and forth so you don't get tired of hearing one of us drone on a lot today. Yeah. So all of these pictures up here are images that I chose to reflect the social, emotional, behavioral, sort of sometimes spiritual impacts that you will see in terms of behavior. These are all very common and known responses that not just kids, but adults have too when we go through something pretty traumatic. So we see behavioral ups and downs. We see something that we refer to as acting out or acting in. Both are examples of distress. Acting in is just when you express your distress internally, and acting out is when you express your distress externally. So that could be a kid flipping over a desk or a kid just sitting there with their head down and not participating. We have stress eating, right? Just snacking, not participating in things. One of my colleagues likes to joke, we went from the quarantine 15 to the COVID-19 to the buttons on my shirt are starting to socially distance from each other. So, I know. So lots of known entities, and this affects kids and adults alike. Substance use goes up, adolescents and teenagers, huge risk factors with risky behavior. We had a colleague who works at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, and she was noting just the incredible increase in accidents from risky behavior, especially during the summer months when things get warm and people are outside just doing risky things. She said the kids have gone outside and lost their minds with some pretty horrific accidents. The tantruming, the isolation, like I mentioned, aggression. I had a middle school principal tell me that he saw two kids get into a fist fight because they were arguing about the pronunciation of a word in their English class. Not something two middle school kids would typically have any opinion about, right? Let alone come to fisticuffs about it. So we see a lot of these common experiences, and part of the work of making mental health in the conversation with what all of us do is normalizing and validating all of these things. Parents especially often think, man, there's something wrong with my kid. There's something wrong with me. for kids and adults alike, the cognitive issues have been a really big issue. And I read something recently that said the human brain wants to know first, am I safe? And then it wants to know, am I cared for or am I loved? Only then will it ask, what can I learn? So those things in that order. And that's really true on a very, very basic biological level, because when our limbic systems are responding constantly to crisis and threat, we are operating in this threat response mode that is primarily oriented around fight or flight or freeze. That is not a learning mode, right? Because the learning takes place in the prefrontal cortex, which is a different, more advanced part of the brain that's not as concerned with safety. So a lot of these behavioral expressions that we're seeing are related to this underlying biological response to feeling unsafe that has to be modulated in a school environment or in any safe environment, so that then we can prime the brain to be able to be ready to learn. We've talked about this. It comes up a lot in PBIS, and Lucille certainly mentioned it this morning. Everybody here is a mental health influencer in some way, right? We're all crisis managers to some extent. This means that offering behavioral health support can and does fall on all of us. And there are not enough professional resources. We all know this. This is not about referrals necessarily. This is about making sure that at the bottom of the pyramid, we are all equipped with accessible behavioral health interventions that we know are effective, which is what we're going to finish with today at the end of this session. This is about having appropriate knowledge for how to deal with things, and also for each of us on a more personal level, like really recognizing when things come up in the lives of our students that are reflective of things that are going on in our personal lives, it's really important to develop that insight and awareness about what our sensitive issues may be. We've all lived through things. We've all had difficult challenges. And when we are trying to support a student who is going through a crisis themselves, this awareness of like, what are the things that are harder for me to help somebody else with? Right? That's a basic tenet of some of our professional training. But it's really important to keep in mind when we are all doing crisis work, because you're going to get confronted by things that you've been through. And having a little bit of equilibrium to slow down and say, okay, this is a hard one for me. I'm going to use my own coping skills here, and then I'm also going to apply those same skills in my teaching with students. So this is part one. We're going to have to shift our language and our terminology away from threat assessment to risk reduction. This is the idea of this is focusing on the processes that we need to put in place to support kids that are at higher risk, and we're automatically going to reduce that by fostering growth dynamics, which we know of, right? We know what they are and we can measure those things. This is correlated with a lot of successful and positive outcomes. So sorry, these slides are a little wonky. I'm not sure what happened here. The difference is this. We're shifting, in clinical psychology, we talk a lot about content and process. Process is often more powerful than content. So the way I do things is often more powerful and meaningful than what it is I'm actually doing, right? Threat assessment is sort of categorical. It's yes or no. It's content. Are they dangerous or are they not dangerous? Risk reduction is not categorical. It lets us see more of the whole person. It provides an opportunity to kind of tailor an intervention or a series of supports that matter for the framework that this particular student is operating with. And it allows us to look upstream, to like get ahead of things rather than to think, oh, so-and-so, you know, they're kind of in crisis. How are we going to fix it or make it better? We're getting ahead of that whole thing. And that's actually less work than trying to fix and trying to clean up and try and support after the fact. This idea of risk reduction is much more effective in the short and in the long run than the yes or no threat assessment after the fact when someone is suspected of having an issue. We're going to have question and answers. Is that okay? Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get through a bunch of stuff. Okay, a little bit more data for you. So we have limits in terms of what we're actually able to predict statistically in terms of risk and threat and future human behavior. You may have noticed humans are kind of complicated. There's a lot happening for each of us. We all know this is a basic tenet. Correlation is not causation. Tona and I talk a lot about some of the research that was done during COVID, and there was a lot of not great research that was done because a lot of things got pushed through just to try and get information out there. But we have to be very careful with what we're reading and what we're using to make conclusions about things and how we're generalizing to the population at large. When you have a sample size of 17, that is not a generalizable sample size. We have to be really clear about the statistics. Risk assessments, that's separate than threat assessment, and I'll explain that in a second, have significant and very harmful flaws often. Usually, there are some problems with predictive validity of risk assessments, but also they're biased in terms of the kind of people who tend to get identified as being higher risk. Again, more on that to come. There's this wonderful website. There's also a book, Beware of Spurious Correlations, right? Spuriouscorrelations.com. Anything can be correlated if you look hard enough at it, right? It doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. So we've got divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. That I picked was shark attacks and milk, like shark attacks in California and the number of gallons of milk consumed in the United States. I don't know. And I can't make this up. This is a real step. So we have to be careful, because just because things are correlated with each other does not mean they are predictive or that one thing causes the other. So this is another quote from Russell Acuff. While we don't know how to measure what we want to measure, we often settle for wanting what we can measure. And that is a slippery slope, right? Because then you get some data at the end that doesn't actually relate to the kinds of things you were trying to understand at the very beginning of the issue. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with some problematic statistics. Now, I know there are a lot of words on these slides, but I picked that for a reason, because I wanted everyone to have access to the whole chunk out of the articles that Rick was able to find to summarize this for you. I wanted you to see where the context was that I was getting these. And I have a little mini reference list within the larger reference list for you. So I highlighted the things in bold that I thought were really important. In the studies that I looked at that sort of summarized where are we with predictive validity and statistics for risk and threat assessment, this is all about risk assessment. Two things. Risk assessments are okay, and sometimes actually pretty good, at predicting whether or not someone's going to do something again. So it's about re-offense, or it's about an additional risk or an additional example of behavior. They are not designed, nor do they do any kind of a good job at predicting whether or not someone will do something. The data that we have is limited, but it's almost always, 99% of it is about whether or not someone will do something again. So this result said the three measures that they looked at showed a moderate effect size in predicting juvenile reoffense, right? This next one says the findings suggest a need for standardization of predictive validity reporting, like how you report that to improve comparison across studies and instruments. So what happens a lot is that one person will do a study on their one instrument, the sample size won't be very big, and then someone will take that and try to generalize it to the population. It's not enough. Other takeaway points from these references. This is a common one. The structured assessment of violence risk in youth. These scores were significantly predictive of any type of reoffending with some variability across racial and ethnic groups. That should be a red flag, right? Static factors were most strongly predictive of nonviolent rearrest, and dynamic factors were the most predictive of violent rearrest. Those are the things that we have control over and can actually influence as educators and supporters. We can influence those social and contextual factors, right? Implication for the use of risk needs assessment tools need further investigation, right? That's discussed in this article. Here's another one. There is a positive evidence to support the use of traditional risk assessment tools to predict future suicidal behavior. So it's not just limited to violence towards others, it's also talking about the limits of suicide prevention risk. And then this one, the VREG. How many of you have heard of the VREG before? Are you familiar with this as a risk tool? This is the most common instrument that's used across the country today. It's called the VREG. The VREG lacks calibration validity. If you don't know what calibration validity is, I was trying to come up with a metaphor in my hotel room this morning. The best one I can come up with is your speedometer measures how many miles per hour your car is going. This would be like having a dial in your car that measures parsecs in space. It's not, calibration validity is whether or not the instrument is conforming to a known standard. So the VREG is measuring something, but it's not measuring risk in the sense that all of us understand what that is and how that makes sense in context with other things. That's a huge problem. So we've got to be really careful. Now, here's an important takeaway. Additional research has found that when it comes to risk, again, please keeping in mind that risk assessment is all about reoffense, or the repetition of behavior of some kind that's dangerous. Some of these researchers that have been working on this for 20 years say that when we're focused on treatment intervention of individual, they call it criminogenic, which I don't prefer that term, but the idea is all of the things that contribute to whether or not somebody's going to break the law, right? When we focus on those individual needs, that is what actually is effective. And that's what PBIS framework is all about. Like working with the systems to support kids and identify those individual pieces that they need to prevent something further from happening downstream. Okay, here's that reference list for you. So lots of, you can go back and read all of these individual articles if you're curious about it. But I'm going to switch gears and talk briefly about threat assessment. So is it better than risk assessment? Marginally is the answer. Threat assessment is designed to predict whether or not someone is going to do something, right? Risk assessment, again, is focused on the likelihood of them doing it again. So there are 5 current threat assessment models that are used around the United States. The most common model is the CSTAG model, and that's the only one that's really been tested. That's the only one there's been data collected on that one. So of all of these, so there's information that's published on them, but there hasn't been statistical data on reliability and validity, except for the CSTAG model. So this is the quote from this source here. This was a massive review that came out just this year. For all models except CSTAG, there is little to no research on their impact on school outcomes, such as reducing school violence and suspensions and expulsions. So that's problematic, because if we are relying in a practical way on summaries and conclusions from instruments that have no data or very little data that can predict something, it's fruit of a poisonous tree. We're using the wrong thing to try and draw a conclusion. Other general findings from this research. This one, now please keeping in mind that the people who are doing the research on this are the people who developed it, right? So there is that. Wow, yeah. The CSTAG schools have demonstrated lower rates of short-term and long-term suspensions, so that's a positive thing, right? They've shown a decrease in disparities between special and general education students, and students of concern that were identified in this model received more mental health counseling and parent conferences. I'm not sure what that means, but parent engagement to some degree. Again, I refer you to this. It was sort of a meta-analysis that was done just this year. So what about racism and discrimination? We know that this is a big issue with risk assessment for sure, because the kinds of things that get highlighted to pull kids out and identify them as being potentially threatening or dangerous are often related to bias and racism. Young people of color are highly disproportionately excluded, and this is one piece of data. During the 2016-2017 academic year, 80% or so of the 185,000 total suspensions were non-white students. That is, it's like I fall short of knowing what to say about that, because it's a huge problem. So using a threat procedure, interestingly enough, may help restore a little bit of equity after the referral process has happened, but here's the issue. When kids get referred into a system for threat assessment, the referral process is biased. So the kids that are getting referred are more likely to be young people of color. Now, once they're in the system, according to the data that we have, which is limited, I really have to stress that. Once they're in that system, the additional standardized measures that are used to determine, okay, where do we go from here and what's going to happen with this kid are more, I should say that they are less biased. But the entry into that process is not. Right? That's still a biased process. So we need more information. We need more data. We need to do this in a different way. What we are doing right now is very limited, and it's dangerous to be basing both risk and threat assessment on faulty statistics. These are just a few other quotes to take away from these articles. The CSTAG, again, the articles are written, not always, but often, by the people who developed the model, so there is that to keep in mind. But it's looking like it's the best option out of other ones that we don't quite understand fully yet, if I were to summarize it that way. Black and Hispanic students and students receiving special education were not more likely to experience exclusionary discipline or law enforcement actions like comparison groups of white students and students not receiving special education services in that model, only in Virginia, I believe it was, yeah. So that's really the only place that this has been tested. We need to do more. Okay, now we're going to talk about what we can do. So this is around how to transition from this idea of threat and risk assessment into mental health screening, triage, and intervention that we know is effective, things that we have better data on, which we're going to show you, things that are sort of more widely used and are more efficacious.
Alrighty then. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I have co-developed and have been engaged in for about 3 years. And the way that it was designed was to start with basically the systems of care which youth enter into behavioral health approach in some way, either counseling or evaluation or some such thing. Top of the list is schools, because where your kids spend most of their day. In addition to that, they're also identified in primary care settings and in hospital emergency rooms, unfortunately, where they come to board while they're in crisis, waiting for a lack of services and out. So when we designed this project, we designed it to identify kids coming from all of those various systems of care. Now, the project is based on a larger school approach in Sonoma County, California, where everything from the triage, which I'll talk about in a minute, to the screening to the intervention was all done within school system in Sonoma County. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between triage and screening and assessment and then clinical practices, because there is a huge amount of confusion. Most of us have been trained in screening of some sort or another, right? We screen for symptoms of anxiety and depression, and we screen for PTSD. But where we want to start and where our project starts is something a little bit different, and it's triage, psychological triage. So what we're looking at with psychological triage are objective risk factors, things that have happened to kids that statistically put them at higher risk for something like PTSD and often depression, because it's transdiagnostic. Kids and adults often don't just get one. As opposed to that, screening looks at the stress measures and functioning. You know, what are the symptoms of depression? How is this in functioning in their day-to-day life? Beyond that, when we get into kind of the clinical realm, you know, as a psychologist, I might do a formal assessment and some kind of an evaluation that's kind of through multi-systems of where the child's life is. And then clinical care comes at the end. Yeah, it's yucky. So I want to talk a little bit about SciStart mental health triage. And it comes out of not only disasters, but it comes out of everyday trauma, if you think about it in those terms. So kids that are in car accidents, you show up in the ED, injured enough that they have to be transported. Also kids that have suffered through a pandemic, kids that have suffered through wildfires, floods, community violence, school shootings, all of the bad things that can happen to kids. So the tool was developed and validated on specific trauma exposures that are actually predictive. So from there, we put it into a model of care. And I'm going to talk about stepped triage, because there is a different approach to the care. So we can identify kids that are at huge danger. They're going to hurt themselves or somebody else. Kids that are high risk. These are kids likely on a path towards PTSD or something. Kids at moderate risk, and then kids that are low risk, really sort of demonstrating resilience. And here's the problem. We have the same event, that happens, let's say a large-scale event. COVID is a good example of this. I would say, the research says somewhere between 50 and 90% of us had transitory distress. I would say it was probably 100%. Most of us experienced insomnia, worrying about, if this is going to come again. With every new variant, we kind of got ratcheted up. that's not predictive of what's going to happen to us in terms of mental health impact. There is a range for kids somewhere between 20 and 40%, depending on whose article you're reading, that will develop as a result of an event a new incidence disorder, something they haven't had before. Most typically, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. With COVID, it also has included prolonged grief disorder, just because of the tremendous amount of death and loss, and depression. So we want to get to those kids that are in the red risk pathway, if you will. In my slide, it's green, Brad. We're also looking at acute danger. So if a child is exhibiting or expressing an intent to harm themselves or someone else, we kick that up. And then we're also looking at social determinants of health, things that get chronic stressors, interpersonal violence, other kinds of ACEs, those sorts of things. And this is why we do this, because symptoms are not predicted. Symptoms do not predict the risk of PTSD. Once you're out, maybe a few months, they're more predictive, but at an onset of something that's happened to a child, they are normative and don't predict. So if you look at these guys, the little guy on the left, he's upset about something. Is he having more distress, or does he have PTSD? And the little guy on the right, is he calm, or is he numb and denying symptoms, just typical in kids, and also a higher risk factor? We don't know. These kids could have experienced the same wildfire, the same community violence. We have no idea which one of those are going to go on to develop PTSD. So you may recognize this. So we want to talk about, developing the intervention at an appropriate level of intensity based on what the child's risk is. And we also want to identify the bottom of the pyramid, sort of the resilience factors. And the interventions are kind of appropriate to the level of risk. It really should not be a one-size-fits-all. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychological first aid. How many of you know what psychological first aid is? Good. All right. Psychological first aid is often the one-size-fits-all intervention. You go through a disaster, you go through some sort of large community event, psychological first aid, and we're good. Everybody's had that, and we're good. That is not how it works. And so what we want to do, psychological first aid is wonderful. The one I particularly like is one called Listen, Protect, Connect. I like it because it's neighbor to neighbor, parent to child, teacher to class. So it fosters this sort of sense of connection as well, which we know is a kind of a protective factor there. So as we move up into the risk category, we have psychiatry. You want that to be the entry point into whatever follows, because that helps us sort in an equitable way. Health support team, Gary's going to talk about a little bit later. And then we move on up into that tier 3, if you will. Kids that are going to need specific psychological intervention. And the intervention in our program is trauma-focused cognitive and behavioral therapy, which has 23 plus randomized controlled trials and is strong evidence-based, really is kind of the gold standards. But we deliver it in the steps fashion. You know this stuff. Just want to show you that I am in this stuff too. So we start here. We don't start with screening. In our program, we start with trauma. Now this is, SciStart is something that can be done in less than 2 minutes. It does not require direct questioning of the child, although you can certainly ask follow-up questions. Parents can provide this information. In the larger project in Sonoma County, kids, I think 3rd grade and up, will do their own self-triage. And so what we want to know is what happened. And for some communities, and we got feedback in particular from Indigenous communities, this is a much more culturally appropriate and satisfactory way to understand what's going on. It's telling your story. So what we want to know in the real world, this is in color, are these items at the top, felt or expressed extreme panic. We know that actual panic is highly correlated with the development of PTSD. They were looking at, did you feel like there's going to die? Did you witness that? Did you witness family members hurt in some way? Were you injured in some way? For kids, the death of a pet, the latency of death, whatever that is. You're housing the livable, you have to go home. Family members are missing. In a car crash, for example, you may have parents who go to one hospital and a kid who comes unaccompanied to the children's hospital for their injuries. So all of these things represent risk factors for kids, and you want to know what those are. This is what the aggregated and de-identified data showed you. This was part of our study last year. But you could see that by pulling together this information, and it comes from school districts. I don't know if anybody's here from Medical Lake. Medical Lake is participating in this. A large multi-site primary care pediatric practice at Seattle Children's Hospital. You can see that it shows you not only kind of what happened, but sort of the categories. Multiple deaths in the family. We saw that a lot, COVID. I was astonished at the amount of deaths that we moved on. But you get this nice graph. And so where you start is the kids over here. You have 9 exposures. That even before you get to get with 1 exposure into truth. And it geolocates. So we can see from our referral partners here in the state, things are happening. So when we developed our program, it was all telebehavioral because it was during the middle of COVID. Nobody was going to school and going to doctor's offices very much. And the idea behind it came from data. We were, I think, one of the first in the country in Washington State to start gathering the data on what was happening to kids in home in the middle of the pandemic. We started watching the numbers of kids showing the IQ rise, watching the amount of suicidal ideation rise, watching the boarding rates rise, all throughout Washington State. And we know that you can't just mend new social workers, psychologists, counselors. It takes years. So what were we going to do? We wanted to increase the workforce as much as we could. We want to reduce barriers, and that's the utilization of telehealth. For parents who can't afford to take an hour or 2 or 3 off of work, drive in child care and them up. And then all of this care was provided at no cost because we got a grant from the state. So what we did was we trained up graduate students. We had graduate students from across Washington State in psychology, counseling, and the work, marriage and family therapy. And we trained them up on trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And we provided a tremendous amount of clinical support around them as they were very great. But they did great. So for those of you who aren't here, TFCBT is kind of in 2 modules. 2 modules. So the first one is kind of the PrAC modules, and it's stabilization approach. So it is psychoeducation about trauma. It's parent coaching, helping them get with behaviors, manageable, affective regulation when you're really upset, how you decide calm, and cognitive coping. Understanding that you're not damaged because of what happened. So you're not a bad person because of what happened. And so in our project, we triage the list, and then we get straight into PTSD. And then we deliver the first 4 modules of graduate to unit. In our project, the larger project in Sonoma County, about 40 to 50% are improved enough that they can graduate prepared at that point. That makes more room for the next kid to come in. The rest of them go on to get what are called citizen modules. It's developing trauma narrative, being able to tell your story comfortably, recognizing trauma triggers and not avoiding them, but managing them. And conjoint care sessions, where the parent also desensitized to what happened to the child, so that everybody's anxiety level goes down, and then they graduate. So the interesting thing, and this number is actually, we have actually corrected it because we have more data. With that, 50% of kids graduating from therapy after only 46 sessions, it increases the provider efficiency in our project 67%. So they're really able to reach more kids and way more impact on those kids. And Sedona County, it's 8 years. I don't know what they're doing. I feel like we're different. So pretend it's a full class. So this is how our project works. We have referral partners through our schools, primary care, and Seattle Children's. So they start with SciSart triage. From there, they have 2 or more risk factors, and we have capacity. They are referred to the University of Washington Psychological Services and Training Center. They set up a virtual BSAN. There's intake workers who are graduate students, bless their hearts. They do a little phone screen. They administer the CPSS spine and just PTSD screener. They assign from our clinicians. They go in, they finish prep, they're screening again. That's where we see those improvement scores, where they drop down the PTSD symptoms, drop down the supplementary levels. They step up to the 10th levels. Finish those, we assess them again. It's really prettier in color, I'll just say. So the other thing that we're doing is what's called measurement-based stare, because as a clinician, you can feel like your child was doing better or worse. We actually want to know what's going on with the child so that we can measure and say, not only are you telling us you're feeling better, but by a clinical measure, you've done more, you're improved. So these are the things that we use. We use the CPSS-5, looking at symptoms of PTSD. We deliver it 3 times. We're looking at depression symptoms. We're looking at anxiety symptoms and functioning. Both the parent and the child do these at specific times in the treatment. And it's operated out of a software system called Mira. And it's delivered automatically to the device of the child and the parent. So if their phone, their tablet, their laptop, right before the next session. So we get these measures over and over again throughout the project. Parents can see the results, the parent can see the results, the child can see the results. And then this is the outcome for this particular approach. The improvement rates in PTSD and overall functioning and depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms and kind of overall functioning, parent and child. This is a measure called the Reliable Change Index, which says what we think we're seeing, we're actually seeing. There's actually a statistical significance in that. So those are the kids. This is the caregiver with their less, as you can see. We have found that the kids' grading and the types of subjective outcomes is actually more accurate than the parent. They just know how they're feeling and know how they're functioning. But again, similar changes. You can see that in some there's a worsening. That happens when you start trauma treatment with some kids. It opens things up. They begin to act out over. The symptoms go up a little bit before they go down. All right, Garrett. You put in a different community.
I'm going to go pretty quickly through this one just for the sake of time and making sure we have time for questions too. So at the bottom end, in addition to thinking about psychological first aid as an intervention in the first few, maybe 48 hours following a critical incident or disaster, we would want to advocate for the use of community-oriented training as well to support behavioral health on the longer term, but also on a little bit more of a detailed level, and that's called HST. So Tona and I developed this program that has 4 components. So the first step is listening and learning. The second one is offering support through the supportive relationship, potentially including other partners and relationships with the student or the child. providing a tool that's teaching something specific, like a CBT technique, an active coping skill, deep breathing, mindfulness, whatever the right menu option is for that kid at that time, and then emphasizing hope for them. Adults have a really important role to play in trust and hope for kids. So HST is based on the idea that anybody can learn these skills. We've trained this to college students, to high school students, to pastors, to teachers, to coaches, anybody who is interested in learning sort of accessible behavioral health support for their community members. It's really anybody. So there are 5 modules that we use this process in. The first one is just an introduction to what happens to people in disasters, sort of those normative experiences, some of the challenges that we all face, what is normal and what is not. The skills and techniques are around active listening, really focusing on that supportive relationship as being a linchpin for reducing behavioral health symptoms. The third one is engaging with key issues. So this is when you're sort of training people, like, how do I know, like, as not a clinician, when something is too much for me? Like, there's something happening with this kiddo and I am not professionally trained and I can't handle this. How do I know when I need to get other people involved, wrap around a little bit more, or at a little bit more of a clinical level? So we teach people what the parameters are for that, including suicide intervention. And then we have a toolkit where we have a collection of menu items where we teach people how to teach these skills, and then promoting boundaries and resilience, making sure that anyone who is offering behavioral health support to other people also takes care of themselves. You all know how important that is, right? You got it. It's a mission critical thing. It's not an option, especially now, where anyone in a caregiver role has to take care of themselves in some reasonable way to continue to do this work. So we developed it to train anyone, right? To sort of increase the base of people at the bottom of the pyramid that are available to provide support. And one of the coolest things about HST, in my opinion, is that it's completely culturally adaptive. So once you train what the process is, you want to encourage the people within the community to use the context that matters for them. So the nonverbal messages, the distancing, the eye contact, the cultural norms and the references, the coping skills that are relevant for that population. So it's adjusted along the way by the people who are in the community that are using it. It's not a prescription like, this is what you do, and then you do this, right? And there's these components that we really want to encourage people to flex and to use in a way that makes the most sense for them. So in general with HST, we've done this a lot internationally. We trained a lot of people in Haiti, and I knew that we were done with that work when I got to sit in the back of a room and watch Haitian trainers deliver the training to new Haitian volunteers, totally in Creole. And I was not even a part of it. I was just sitting back watching it. That was a really, really exciting thing. We've been doing a lot of work in the Arab world. We trained Jordanian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Palestinian refugees and relief workers, and a lot of teachers too. We've done a lot of education with that. And then in Poland, we work with Ukrainian refugees. We've also done a lot of training with teachers, school nursing staff, and medical personnel in the US here too. So I'm going to summarize with some of the factors that we know work to decrease risk. So we talked a lot about the issues with statistics when it comes to risk and threat assessment. Everything that we're going to share with you now is evidence-based interventions that we know actually have a significant positive outcome, or influence, I should say, on good outcomes for kids. So what can we do that actually works? We want to focus on process. We want to focus on the way we do things, and simple health factors. We've known for a long time that if you send a kid to school with an empty tummy, they're not going to be able to learn as well. But what about a traumatized brain, right? Let's start including that in this conversation too. Being creative and accessing existing resources. There are often so many resources within a community that we are not aware of or we're not engaged with. And so that's part of this whole involving community members and creating a wider network, right, to reduce symptoms and increase resilience. And then rolling out these triage and screening processes. So starting with triage, what has the child been exposed to? And then what are the appropriate interventions and the level of care that's needed based on those exposure risks. So here's what they need, right? We need safety and routine and security. That is to reduce the activity in the limbic system. That's to reduce the fight or flight or freeze response. That is to allow the brain to even have the possibility of absorbing information and experiencing a calm day. If the limbic system is in charge of the brain, you're on a different pathway to begin with until that gets a little bit more regulated. They need trust. They need honest answers and explanations. There's a lot of really difficult stuff, horrible things happening in the world, and we need to be, in a developmentally appropriate way, we need to be honest and sharing and straightforward with kids about what's going on. And then we need to give them some sort of sense of control and help. What is a contribution that they can do? What is something that they can be part of that's meaningful to them, that anchors them in this sense of efficacy? I can do something about what I'm experiencing, or I can help somebody else, right? Sometimes when you expand your influence to support someone else who's in crisis, you end up reducing your own mental health symptoms too. So I'm going to summarize for you, this is one of those acronyms, sort of some best practices for evidence-based coping skills and interventions. I'm going to go through each one pretty briefly, and then we'll do questions. So we want to start with identifying internal strengths and external resources. Usually when people are in crisis, we forget what these things are. We lose sight of what we have going for us and the skills and the coping options that we've used before because we're in crisis and we're focusing on what's wrong. So it's about redirecting attention. And depending on what your relationship is with a student, right? If it's a student in your classroom, sometimes you could be as clear as to actually write these things down. Like, let's make a reminder of what some of your internal strengths are. You have so much perseverance, you don't give up, right? You believe in yourself. All these skills and all these abilities, people forget. Adults too. And then external resources. Who are your people? What's your network? What are your connections? Is that a coach? Is that a club? Is that a best friend? Is that faith community? What are those resources that you have, and what are the ones that are still needed? And if you don't want to go so far as to like write it down concretely, you can just have a discussion to bring it up and remind. Like, these are the things that you have on your side. The second piece is develop an insight and awareness. This might not be a shock to any of you, but if an adult is dysregulated, they can't regulate a dysregulated kid. Okay, not going to happen. So, being aware of your own state of being. Where's your limbic system today? Maybe that should be above the door when you walk in. How's your limbic system today? How regulated are you? Are you feeling threatened? Like, even a little, like in a subtle way, because that will absolutely show up in how you respond to other people, the types of behaviors that you engage in, like the level of patience that you use. Patience and limbic activity do not go together, right? If you feel threatened, you are not going to respond patiently. You will respond usually impulsively and somewhat always, I would say, defensively, sometimes aggressively, right? So insight and awareness about your level of regulation allows you to facilitate the best response to that student. When it comes to resilience, boy, this is such a buzzword, isn't it? These days, resilience, this and that, we talk about it all the time. It's unfortunate because Tona and I have been talking about resilience for decades before it became a buzzword, but we want to make it operationalized for you. So these are the 4 ingredients of resilience, the 4 components. Purpose, adaptability, hope, and connection. And I'm using the model of the tree here because that's a good way to keep them all sort of in mind together. Purpose is the fruit of the tree. What is your motivation? And I'm saying you, but I mean, you can apply it to yourself personally as well as to the students that you're supporting, right? What are you contributing to that's meaningful? Purpose is about goals and meaning, not one or the other. It's a combination of what's meaningful and what the goals are around that. So if you have not thought for yourself, like, how am I going to sort of redefine my sense of purpose as I'm moving through this world in 2023, I would encourage you to do that. Think about the things that are meaningful and think about the goals that you can set in relation to that. And then also think about that in terms of your students. What are the things that are important to them? What are the ways that they find meaning? Adaptability, that's the trunk of the tree that sways in the storm. This one is the hardest for people. Humans don't like so much adaptability, especially when we've kind of been forced to. There's been so much change in recent years that one of the consequences of that is this, cognitively what happens is that we kind of double down on what it is we think we know. When we're forced into so much change, it's like, well, you're not going to make me change this, right? Whatever the thing may be. So here's a question for you rhetorically. When was the last time you changed your mind about something? Anything. And if it's been a minute, you might want to think why that might be the case, right? Just that the level of comfort with that when things change, it doesn't have to be threatening. right? Change isn't bad. It's not inherently bad. It's how we manage it, right? My best example of adaptability that I can give you, let's see if I have time. I do. We came home on Christmas Eve years ago to find out that my 5-year-old had turned off our refrigerator. And we had a rotten prime rib, back when it wasn't like $50,000 a pound like it is now. It was still expensive, right? And everything was rotten in the freezer. It was so gross. My husband was mad, right? The kids are asleep in the car. It's 3:30 on Christmas Eve and we have nothing. And so I'm thinking, okay, somebody needs to go to the store. Let's make a list and get that done. So I went into problem solving mode and he was in limbic system mode. Fine. Limbic isn't bad. Emotions aren't bad. It's what you do with it that matters. So I'm like, okay, let's help me make a list, let's go. And he looked at me and he goes, I just need to be mad for a second. And I will never forget that because it was his way of recognizing I'm gonna have my moment, I'm just gonna do some paces in the car until I can calm down and then I'm gonna help you problem solve. And recognizing that gift of like that neurological ability that humans have to sort of, okay, like mad is okay, like that's part of our normal experience. Being upset is part of the deal, but what you do with it then, that matters. That's a good example I find of adaptability and how important it is to approach after you've been done being mad. Problem solving is around what are your options, what are your resources, and what's your first step. How do you tackle it? Right? That's the prefrontal cortex piece. The third ingredient in resilience is hope, which is the moss that grows on the north side of the tree, where it's dark and cold. Moss thrives there, hope thrives in crisis. Hope is about realistic opportunity. What are the realistic options that you have that will help you identify shifting your thinking from threat, I'm threatened, I don't have any choices, to, okay, I have options that I hadn't considered before. And that might give me hope. It's really hard to be creative when you feel threatened, right? The creative part of the brain also doesn't go with limbic stuff. So as an adult who is supporting a kid who doesn't feel hopeful, right? Part of the job sometimes is to be hopeful on their behalf until they can feel it too, which can require some degree of creativity. And then the final piece of resilience is connection, the roots of the tree. Those are our people. It doesn't have to be a whole big group of people, it can be 1 or 2 people, but we all need connection desperately. It can be any kind of social group, big community, family members, friends, recreational sports league, doesn't matter, right? Okay, just a moment on active coping. These are the 3 categories that Tona and I talk to people about all the time, the most common 3 categories of stress and symptoms that people experience. For anxiety, we really want to emphasize a sensory approach. Anything that you can get going for yourself or for kids that's sensory, sight, touch, taste, smell, or sound to help ground you in the present moment. Because most anxiety is around what happened yesterday or last week or what hasn't happened yet. And if you can really focus your brain on what's happening right now, you're going to reduce symptoms much more effectively. My favorite example of this that I like to share is like the idea of a frozen orange. Keeping oranges in the freezer in your nurse's office, in your home freezer, doesn't matter. A frozen orange is a wonderful tool for panic attacks and anxiety. Because you take a frozen orange out and peel it or try to pick at it and manipulate it. Usually people don't hate the smell of oranges and your brain is focused on the cold, right? And another sort of more extreme example is a Ziploc bag or a bowl full of ice cubes and water. Hold hands 20 seconds. It will stop the panic attack almost all the time. Actually, I've never seen that not work. I don't know if you have one. A hot or cold shower, right? How many of you have seen Die Hard, the movie? Die Hard? I'm actually bringing that into an academic professional presentation. Die Hard, great Christmas movie. There's a scene in Die Hard where he's a nervous flyer and the guy next to him says, when you get to your hotel, take off your shoes and make fists with your toes in the carpet. And he does that and then he's running around with bare feet the rest of the movie. But the point is that technique, you can do it in your shoes, you can do it now if you want to, just deep, slow breathing and then slowly curling up and releasing each of your feet one at a time, activates your parasympathetic nervous system and calms you down. And that is a technique that kids can do at their desk and no one will see it or notice it. Really slow, right? Toes one after the other. Just think of Die Hard and Bruce Willis. Now for exhaustion, really it's around either that you can't turn your brain off at night and it's spinning, or do you have trouble because your brain wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning ready to go and you're not rested, right? So we are not doing a great job with sleep hygiene. And the American Sleep Association identified revenge bedtime procrastination as a thing, which is when people stay up on their phones. I kind of did it last night a little bit, too, until some ridiculous hour of the morning, 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning without getting rest. And it sets your whole day off. Talk about not helpful for your brain, right? The limbic system tends to be a little bit more influential when we're tired. So getting good rest is a big deal. Keeping a pad of paper by the side of your bed, so if your brain wakes you up, you're not grabbing a device, right? Write down on the pad of paper the things that wake you up. Alcohol and caffeine and sugar, right? Being mindful of not having big highs or lows, especially before bed. And then depression. This one's tough. Making a coping plan. Making a list, and here's what that might look like. Sorry, I'm going to go quickly. You write down. Now, I have a color-coded Excel spreadsheet for this. For people who know me, maybe that's no surprise at all. But this could look like a sticky note. This could look like a sticky note on your bathroom mirror or your refrigerator, right? You write down a list of things that you will use, or that and for kids to do this too, a list of stuff that makes them feel better, that's healthy, right? It's getting into the holiday season, so I don't want to put eat a box of chocolate, because that will make me feel temporarily better, but other consequences. So only put coping options that you're going to actually use, right? And put things on there. The biggest issue is that you only put things on there that take relatively short amounts of time. If everything on your coping plan takes an hour to do, you are never going to use your coping plan. So things that you can do at work in 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, a variety of windows for options. It takes 7 seconds to send a text message on average. And it's a really easy way to send a funny joke or a meme to somebody that you care about. Just let them know you're thinking about them. And then there's that connection piece. Right? So it doesn't have to take a long time, but we want to be as efficient as we can with our coping choices. So making a plan, using a plan, this is one of the things that we know works for adults and kids. And honestly, it's really helpful if you model these responses, right? If you talk about this stuff because you're doing it too, especially if you're working with older kids, it's much more meaningful rather than just some concept. And the last part in the ideal model is listening and effective communication. Now, this is by no means the least important. This is probably the most important as a foundation. But it starts with knowing where your body is. How tired are you? How regulated are you? How threatened do you feel? If you are in the red zone, you are not going to be able to problem solve that day. You need to get yourself regulated in order to be able to come down to that green or yellow zone to be able to problem solve. When the body releases adrenaline, when we feel threatened, it takes 45 to 60 minutes to reabsorb adrenaline. So you're not going to be able to transition from that red zone to that green zone in less than a half an hour at the very minimum. So consider that in terms of timing. Application of this challenge mindset. What are my options? What are my resources? And what is my first step? And then really being aware of your nonverbal messages. Think about the energy that you use when you walk into a room. What is the walk-up song, right? Baseball walk-up song? I got to pick my walk-up song a couple weeks ago when I did a talk. I didn't know what to pick. It was really awkward. But my 5-year-old, his walk-up song is Darth Vader March. Dun, 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 dun. He will walk around our house humming that. I'm not sure what that means. He's bringing a vibe. He's bringing energy to the room. But it says something, right? It gives a presence, and we have control over that to create that. With our nonverbal, we don't even have to say anything. It's just the energy and the vibe you bring into the space. So I think that's it. We want to highlight these skills and really represent this as being sort of a linchpin of some behavioral health support. Active listening is the 5-star recommendation. Most of us know what this is, and very few people do it well. That's the bottom line. Practicing this, just listening to understand. Listening with the purpose of understanding. I had a person tell me once, I don't feel like I'm actually doing anything when I'm active listening. But your job isn't to do something, your job is to understand them. Not to offer something, it's just to understand them. So when you transition that in your mind, that your job is not to fix a problem, it's to understand it, it helps with this. There are a few considerations for active listening for kids, and then we're going to go ahead and take questions. So any window is a good window, right? I'm learning that with my kids. 11 o'clock. Mom, I want to talk about, like, really? Right now? Also in the car, they want to talk in the car because you're moving together and you're not facing off against them over the kitchen table, right? Slow down. Positive reinforcement. Future focusing. Help them identify and set goals that are meaningful to them to reinforce purpose. Take a break if you need to take a break and walk away. There are just things that we know that work better than others, right? And we will wrap up with this. It's time to change behavioral health intervention and support from, is this student a threat, to what does this student need to thrive? Right? All right. Thank you.
Do we have the other? So we have a couple minutes for questions, and if you do have a question, I'm going to run over with a microphone like Phil Donahue, if anybody knows who that is. All right, there are 3 people that know who Phil Donahue is. All right, yes.
Thank you for your presentation today. I just have a question about your SciStart triage. How is that different from the Childhood Trust Event Survey? And then sub-question, can districts and or other organizations use just the SciStart triage model and not the teletherapy?
In answer to the second question, yes. In fact, one of the things that we're engaged in right now is a national initiative through there's a large HRSA-funded grant called the Pediatric Pandemic Network, which is actually an all hazards for kids network.
Terrible name.
It is a terrible name. And we have a learning collaborative where we are engaging with the 10 children's hospitals across the country and their spoke organizations, hospitals, where we are training this out for everyday trauma of all sorts. It has been used in, most recently in Texas with the Allen Mall shooting. So it's a standalone in terms of identifying and equitably providing care to those impacted. So we all know people who can get care for their kids. This says, we have the data that says these 5 kids need to come in front of your kid because we've recognized that. So yeah, you can use it independent of whatever the intervention is. And the difference between it and most of the other tools that I'm aware of, not specifically aware of that one, is that there is actual data, supportive data, to show that there's a statistical correlation between these specific trauma exposures and the later development of something like PTSD.
Thank you for your question. Other questions? Any final thoughts or comments from you all? I am so happy that Kira and Tona have joined this conference. I'm like fan club. The last 2 years, I've just wanted everyone to know all of this content. So we have another session tomorrow. It's the last session of the day, 6C, where you can learn a little bit more about the phases of crisis response and recovery. We know what to do, and you all are creating the conditions for everyone to thrive in the systems, and you're doing this work. So I hope, just a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming and joining us and all the content.